Welcome to the How to Play video for Evolution, the first strategy game from North Star Games, the makers of the hit party games Wits and Wagers and Say Anything. Today I'm here to serve as your introductory guide to the components, rules, and gameplay of Evolution, so that you can jump right in and begin your quest to outsmart, out-evolve, and out-survive the competition. In Evolution, players do the work of nature by putting species into play and evolving them trait by trait, helping them survive in a changing environment. There are two threats that players have to deal with for their species, however: starvation and predation by carnivores. The goal of the game is to get the most points by feeding your species, increasing their population, and evolving them to best ensure their survival. Before we get into gameplay, let's take a quick look at what you'll get inside the box. Here you can see the components for Evolution laid out before you. The first that I'd like to talk about is the species board. Each player will begin the game with one species represented by one of these boards, and for each species they create, they'll get an additional board to keep track of its different traits. Each species you get will start at population 1, body size 1, but you'll want to increase these as the game goes on. You'd like to increase population because it will allow you to eat more food, which will be points scored at the end of the game. You can either eat plant food or meat food if you happen to be a carnivore or possess a different trait that will allow you to ingest this food. You'd like to increase your body size to protect yourself from being eaten by carnivores, or, as a carnivore yourself, be able to eat a larger diversity of creatures that are smaller than you. In addition to these components, you're going to get 117 trait cards in the form of a deck. Inside of this deck there are 18 different traits, 7 of which you can see represented here. Each of these trait cards will have a similar layout but different effects. We can see this one here is a carnivore card, which will make the species you play it on into a carnivore if you use it as a trait. Beneath the title, you'll see that there's a picture representing that trait, in this case a saber-toothed tiger. At the bottom you can see the effects of the trait when played on one of your species. This one says that the species becomes a carnivore and may attack other species on the table so long as it's larger than they are and has all of the appropriate traits. Underneath that it says that it may no longer eat plant food, it solely eats meat from this point on. In the bottom right hand corner of all of these cards, you can see that there's a number backed by green. This is that number's food value, which will be used when discarding cards during the feeding selection phase in order to contribute food to a general food supply from which everyone will eat later in the round. Different types of traits will have different types of utility. For example, there are offensive traits, things like carnivore, which allow you to attack other species, or good eyesight, which negates the effects of camouflage, a defensive trait. There are also, of course, defensive traits, things like horns, which will reduce the population of any carnivore that attacks a species with them, or burrowing, which will allow a species that's fully fed to go underground and be safe from being attacked, unless, of course, the carnivore finds a way around it. There's also hardshell, which makes your species generally harder to attack by having it simulate being 3 larger in size during the game. In addition to those, there are non-offensive or defensive traits, things like scavenger, which allows you to feed when another carnivore attacks a species. So if a carnivore attacks that species, you help to pick the bones clean and will get some meat food in response. Finally, we have something like fertile, which is going to allow your species to kind of improve itself as the game goes on. Every time food is revealed for a round, you'll get an extra population, making you able to eat more food throughout the game. The last thing that each player will get is a baggie that looks much like this, in which you'll be placing food that you eat throughout the game at the end of rounds. This will help keep your score secret so that other players have no idea, or at least very little idea, as to how well you're doing. A game of Evolution will take place over a variable number of rounds, with each round having 5 phases. The number of rounds in the game will depend on how quickly this deck of trait cards is exhausted, with the last card being drawn from the deck signaling the last round. The first phase of each round is going to be dealing cards, so why don't we take a quick look at phase 1. Phase 1 of each round of Evolution is dealing cards, and the number of cards that get dealt will depend on how many surviving species a player has. At the start of the game, each player has 1 species of body size 1, population 1. The base number of cards you always get dealt is 3, and you get +1 for each species you have on the board. So in this case, at the start of a game, each player will be dealt 4 cards from the top of the deck. In future rounds, if a player were to have additional species, for example, this player has another species out on the board of body size 1, population 1, they would be dealt 5 cards, the base of 3 +1 for each of their species. Phase 2 of a round of evolution is the food selection phase, in which each player will take a look at their dealt hand of cards and choose one of these cards to contribute to the food pool for the round. We'll see that our player has cards of food value -1, 2, 1, and 5. But those aren't the only things they need to consider. They need to consider the traits on these cards and what they'd like to use later in the round for adapting and changing their species. So, perhaps our character doesn't want to go carnivore right off the bat. This is a possible discard. Or maybe they're not interested in becoming a scavenger right away, so they would discard that card. But they're interested in long neck, and good eyesight would be good to keep if they kept their carnivore for later. So, perhaps they decide to discard scavenger to the center of the table. This would provide 5 food to the food pool, which will be revealed later. So each of these cards is discarded in secret, other players not knowing what you're contributing, and you not knowing what the other players are contributing to the food pool. So perhaps our player discards this to the center, contributing to the food pool for the round, and keeps their other cards. Each other player would select one card from their hand in order to contribute to the center of the table, in this case a 4-player game, having 4 cards contributed. A note that you will not recover these cards, they are discarded permanently and only provide food for the current round. The third phase in a round of evolution is the card play phase, in which players will be using the remaining trait cards in their hand in order to play out traits, increase the population and body size, or create new species for their board. We know that we have 3 cards left as we discarded 1 to the food supply during the food selection phase. We're going to take a look at these and we're going to go over the 4 possible options of what you can do with your trait cards on your turn. The first option of what you can do with trait cards on your turn is you may play them as traits onto species you already have on your board, or onto species that you create throughout your turn. Our character has a carnivore, a good eyesight card, and a long neck card remaining. Perhaps they've decided they don't want to go carnivore in the first round of the game, thinking there won't be enough species for them to target, or that the species will be too difficult to target at the start of the game. This kind of negates the use of good eyesight for this round, because good eyesight is a trait that allows carnivores to see species that have camouflage. So, if you're not going to choose carnivore, you're likely not going to play good eyesight. However, they do have a long neck card. The long neck card will allow them to receive 2 food once these food cards are revealed later in the round, and they'll take that food from the bank rather than the general food supply that everyone's going to have to share. So perhaps they decide to play this out to their tableau. Anytime you play a card as a trait, you're going to play it face down in front of the species board for that species. This will be revealed later at the end of the card play round and will become active trait on that species. A species may not have more than 3 traits on it at any time, so I could play all 3 of these traits out to my species, but it would now be full. Trait cards that have already been discarded to the table may be discarded at a future point in order to be replaced with a new trait card to adapt that species. The second type of action you may take with your trait cards during your turn is that you may discard them from your hand for an effect. The first effect is that you may discard a card from your hand, a trait card, face up, in order to increase the population of your species by 1. As I mentioned earlier, this will allow you to eat more food, and in this case, since the player is going to get to take 2 food from the supply when food cards are revealed, he would likely increase his population by 1 so as to be able to eat both of those food. You may only eat food equal to your total population. The third use you have for trait cards on your turn is that you may discard them in order to increase your body size. So for example, I could discard my carnivore card in order to increase my body size from 1 to 2. As mentioned earlier, the reason you would like to do this is if you are a carnivore, in order to be able to attack smaller species than you, or if you are not a carnivore, in order to protect yourself from being eaten by a carnivore at the table. The last use for cards during the play cards phase is going to be to discard them to create new species. So rather than maybe increasing our body size, we decide to discard our carnivore card in order to create a new species. When we do so, we're going to take a new species board and we're going to place it in front of us, adding a new species to our play area. When we do so, we must play it either to the left or the right of all of our existing species. So in this case, I could play it either here, or I could slide this over this direction and play it right here. If we were to create another species in the future, we would go ahead and we'd have to create it to either the far left or far right of all of our existing species. So maybe we would decide to place it here, but could not place it between the 2 existing species. At the start of the feeding phase, the first player is going to reveal all of the cards selected during the food selection phase to see how much food is available in the food pool. So we'll flip these over and we'll see that we have 5 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 food available for this round. These cards would then be discarded and 14 plant food would be moved from the plant food bank into the current plant food supply available for players to eat. In addition, any species that have traits that allow them to do something when food is revealed would trigger at this point. So, the player with long neck on their species here would immediately take 2 food from the food bank and place it on their species. We can see that this species now has food equal to their population and will be unable to eat for the rest of the feeding phase. Once those traits have activated, we're going to begin the normal feeding for the round, in which players have one of 2 choices that they can make on their turn to feed. They may either take food from the general food bank available to all of the players in the turn, or they can attack with a carnivore, something that we'll cover in just a moment. If they're taking from the food bank, they're going to be able to take 1 food at a time, unless they have a trait which will allow them to take more. Rather than taking plant food from the food supply, carnivores must attack other species in order to get their food. This carnivore, who happens to have good eyesight, would like to attack this long neck over here, who happens to have camouflage. Well, it's convenient that good eyesight negates the effects of camouflage, or our species over here would be safe. In addition, our carnivore needs to be larger in body size at size 3 than our long neck, which happens to be body size 2. In this case, our carnivore fulfills all of the requirements of attacking this long neck. So our carnivore chooses to attack the long neck. What happens here is that the carnivore will get food equal to the body size of the species it's attacking, in the form of meat food that will go on its card. In this case, 2, and it would place 2 meat food on its card. This fully satisfies the food requirements of our carnivore, but it also affects our long neck, who will be reduced in population by 1. If at any time a species is reduced below 1 population, it becomes extinct, the cards on it are discarded as well as the species board, and the owner of the species will get a number of trait cards dealt back to them equal to the trait cards they lost by having their species go extinct. In addition, our long neck will lose 1 of the food that it's eaten for the round, because it no longer has enough population to score that food, so the food would be returned back to the food supply, unable to be scored by our long neck player. Now that we're done with the feeding phase, we move on to phase 5, which is the end of the round. The first thing we're going to do at the end of the round is we're going to check and see if each of our species is fully fed. We can see that this species right here is not fully fed as it's only eaten 1 food, but had a population of 2. In this case, you're going to reduce the population of the species to equal the amount of food that it ate. One of the members of that species starves off, which could have been an extra victory point at the end of the game, and in addition, reduces the amount of food it can eat the next round unless you pump that population back up using traits such as fertility or by discarding cards to increase your population. Once you've done this for all of your species, you're going to take the food that they have eaten and you're going to add that to your bag here, hiding the points that you accumulated from eating food throughout the game. This does not hide all of a player's points, as population is worth 1 point each at the end of the game, as are trait cards on all of your surviving species. Once this is completed, you will pass the start player marker to the player on the left of the current start player, and you'll begin a new round at phase 1, dealing cards. And there you have it. That is Evolution from North Star Games, coming to you on Kickstarter in May of 2014. This is a dynamic game of survival in which you must adapt to the changing ecosystem in the game, which of course is dictated by the other players, the trait cards you have in your hand, and of course the amount of food available in the supply. Do you decide to take the defensive route, creating a large or well-specialized species that can avoid predation but perhaps eats less food over a longer period of time? Or will you create a cast of smaller species, ones that are able to get in quickly, take a lot of the food, but may be more susceptible to predation? When do you, if ever, decide to become a carnivore yourself? Do you do so to take out other pesky species, or perhaps just to remove yourself from the dwindling food supply? For more information on Evolution, please follow the blog of Dominant Crapuchettes on Board Game Geek, visit the Evolution page to look for session reports and reviews, and of course, keep an eye on Kickstarter. If you'd like to get emails, you can sign up or email Ryan at North Star Games in order to get on that list, and we will notify you when the Kickstarter launches and when the Kickstarter is about to end. Thank you for watching our video, and we hope that you enjoy Evolution.